Pokémon just won't stop predicting the future. Predictions that come out of nowhere, uncannily precise, from technology that wouldn't exist for decades, to real historical events, the kind that makes you wonder, how much do these people actually know? And that is Gumshoos. I'm sure you remember it. It's 2016, Pokémon Sun and Pokémon Moon are announced, and with them, a wave of new Pokémon. Among them, Gumshoos, flooding social media because of how much it looked like Donald Trump. But no, Gumshoos is actually a detective. More specifically, the classic inspector stereotype, with the trench coat and slicked back hair, playing on the idea of a species introduced to Alola to control the invasive Rattata population, which had taken on a mafia-like behavior. All jokes and memes, until 2 years ago when Trump was shot, losing part of his ear. And which Pokemon has ears that look like a piece has been torn off? But in search of more predictions, let's take the magnet train to Johto, which was itself a small prediction. This train, capable of reaching incredible speeds by using electromagnetic fields, is based on magnetic levitation technology, which was already being experimented with around the time Gold and Silver released. But the magnet train connected Goldenrod City and Saffron City, based on Osaka and Tokyo, and in 2015, 15 years after the games came out, a real maglev line would begin construction between those two cities. But now that we're in Johto, hidden behind the morning dew, there's another Pokemon that was once treated as a joke, yet ended up predicting a historical event in an even more precise and unsettling way. Sunkern, known for the infamous achievement of being the weakest Pokemon statistically, only surpassed in Generation 7 by Wishiwashi in its base form. Of course, that one could transform into its school form and become a monster, while Sunkern could barely evolve into this. So how could such a frail creature possibly predict the future? Well, in the Johto remakes, just outside the national park, they introduced the Pokéathlon, essentially Pokemon Olympics, where each Pokemon's performance depends on a unique set of stats: speed, power, skill, stamina, and jump. Every species has its own values, but just like the 5 Olympic rings, there are 5 Pokemon capable of maxing out all 5 stats. Arceus, for obvious reasons. Mew, because it carries the DNA of all species and has limitless potential. Ditto, for the same reason. Giratina, but only in its origin form, perhaps because the laws and limits of that world don't apply to it. And then, Sunkern. I always thought this was just a Game Freak joke. You know, the weakest Pokemon becoming completely broken in that one specific setting. What no one could have imagined is that years later, this joke would end up predicting, almost disturbingly precisely, one of the most important events in Japan. Because Pokemon is a Japanese franchise, and the Olympic Games, the very inspiration behind the Pokéathlon, where Sunkern shines, have only been held in Japan twice, 1964 and 2020. And in Tokyo 2020 Olympics, Japan chose to honor the areas most affected by the Fukushima nuclear disaster with sunflowers, the very flower Sunkern is based on. This is because sunflowers can absorb radiation from the soil, as certain radioactive isotopes are molecularly similar to the nutrients they need to grow. In fact, after nuclear disasters, one of the most effective ways to help clean the land is by planting sunflowers. Sunkern are also said to absorb sunlight and nutrients from the ground. What if that joke about Sunkern being overpowered in the Pokéathlon was tied to the very thing sunflowers represent in the real world? Now, what if, instead of talking about Game Freak predicting future events, we talk about how the community anticipated Game Freak's own future ideas? The first, and most iconic case, were the so-called Pokégods, sprites that, in the early days of the internet in the late 90s, people created however they could, using the limited tools of the time, sharing them across forums and small websites. Many of these images would eventually reach the young and innocent fandom of that era, spreading like wildfire as rumors of mysterious Pokémon obtainable through secret methods. Many of these Pokégods were new evolutions that pushed already fully evolved Pokémon beyond their limits, coming unsettlingly close to what would later become Mega Evolution. A lot of these designs were edgy, even grotesque, in line with Pokédex entries that vividly describe how Pokémon undergo painful transformations in exchange for power. Even the supposed evolution method was often something called a mist stone, eerily reminiscent of Mega Stones. And it makes you wonder, is it possible, even slightly, that these dreamlike creations reached the ears of Game Freak and lingered in their subconscious, eventually blooming years later into something like Mega Evolution? It might sound far-fetched, but something like that has happened before in Pokémon. Dreams and ideas from fans becoming reality. In Pokémon Gold and Pokémon Silver, after saving the Slowpoke from the Slowpoke well, defeating Bugsy, and facing your rival, you enter the Ilex Forest. At its heart stands a shrine dedicated to the Guardian of the Forest, whose identity was originally unknown until Pokémon Crystal revealed it to be Celebi, a gentle and playful grass-type Pokémon that moves through time as naturally as the forest breathes. But that was not the original plan. Although Celebi already existed within the code of Gold and Silver, it was completely unobtainable, and Ilex Forest and that mysterious shrine had nothing to do with it. You might think this was simply foreshadowing, that they were saving the event for Crystal. But no. According to Hironobu Yoshida, the lead graphic designer of Pokémon Gold and Silver, the shrine was just a decorative element, something they added to make the forest prettier, without any deeper meaning. In fact, it doesn't even use a unique graphic, it simply reuses building edge tiles from that area. And yet, when images of Celebi, the mysterious Pokémon 251, began to spread, fans immediately connected it to that location. They believed it was the Guardian referenced by the shrine, and began trying countless methods to summon it. And Game Freak, who by then already understood the power of rumors and urban legends, decided to reward that imagination. The original plan was most likely to distribute Celebi directly through the Pokémon Communication Center in Goldenrod City. After all, event items like tickets to special islands didn't exist yet. Celebi came before all of that, and before it, the only mythical Pokémon, Mew, had been distributed directly as well. Celebi was meant to embody time travel, so receiving it through the mobile adapter, a system that itself bent the limits of the cartridge, made perfect sense. But inspired by the community's rumors, they changed course. Instead, what you would obtain there was the GS Ball, which, when placed at the shrine, would summon Celebi. That retcon even made its way into the Pokédex. In the original Gold and Silver, Celebi is described simply as a time traveler, but starting in Crystal, it becomes the Guardian of the Forest. And it's beautiful, because for once, the fans' theories were better than the original idea. A Pokémon that travels through time is interesting, but a being that protects nature by restoring dying forests through time, that's poetry. In this story, the fans didn't just predict the future, they rewrote it. And in the next generation, it happened again. In Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire, we encounter another seemingly insignificant mystery, the White Rock in Moss Deep. Once again, the same thing happened. The community immediately linked it to that generation's hidden Pokémon, Jirachi, and rumors spread about how to break it open and summon the mythical Pokémon. But this time, they didn't add an emerald. That would have been too predictable. Instead, in the next generation, at the very end of your journey, they introduced another white rock. This one, far more imposing. Studied by Professor Oak himself, leaving no doubt that this was a place meant for dreaming, hiding something special. And it was. As a reward for that same dreamer spirit, for players who, even after all these years, across generations, still allow themselves to imagine beyond the cartridge. And in response, a long, beautiful path of flowers opens before you. At the end of that path waits Shaymin, a love letter to the player, to every idea, every illusion, every dream poured into this world, with the Gracidia, the flower of gratitude, as its symbol. Speaking of dreams and imagination, Paradox Pokemon had to make it into this video if we're talking about predicting the future. Specifically, Iron Thorns, which is strikingly similar to Amorphous, a mechanical Tyranitar that appeared years ago in one of the Pokestar Studios films. This time, I'd go as far as to say it's less of a prediction and more of a direct reference. The concept is exactly the same, but what makes this case especially interesting, and why I wanted to include it, is that it reopens the debate around Paradox Pokemon. Are they simply creatures from a distant timeline? Or are they manifestations created by Terapagos, bringing to life someone's idealized vision of the future? Maybe it's both. Even if they are real beings from another dimension, Terapagos could be pulling them from the timeline that best fits those ideals, using them as a compass. Everything was left deliberately ambiguous. But the fact that this Tyranitar, completely fictional, created as part of a dystopian movie script, ends up being so similar to a Paradox Pokemon, at the very least, makes you wonder. But if we go even further back, to one of the earliest concepts of what would become Pokemon, we find another incredible case of predicting something in the real world. Nidoking. A purple rhinoceros that injects venom through its horn, a bizarre idea, something you'd only expect from Pokémon, or maybe not. Because many years later, in South Africa, a desperate idea emerged in response to rising poaching, injecting rhino horns with poison. Or more specifically, a mixture of toxic parasiticides and pink dye. At first glance, injecting toxins into an animal sounds absurd if the goal is to protect it. But the logic was that the rhino itself wouldn't be harmed. The horn is made of keratin with no direct connection to the bloodstream, while the product would become contaminated and impossible to sell. It would cause nausea and non-lethal illness, essentially a poisoned status effect. So nearly 20 years after Nidoking was designed, there was a real-world proposal that would have resulted in rhinos with toxic, pink-colored horns roaming the savannah. But in the end, the spell was broken. Conservationists ultimately deemed the method unviable. The toxin didn't distribute properly through the dense horn fibers, and since rhino horns continuously regenerate, the process would need to be repeated constantly, making it far too expensive and inefficient. The abstract idea behind Nidoking almost became reality, but reality pushed it back into fiction. Another Pokemon from that early era that in its own way anticipated the future is Kangaskhan. Not many players actually took the time to read its Pokédex entry, and yet there's something strange about it. It's the only one that explicitly refers to the Pokemon as female at a time when gender mechanics didn't even exist yet, aside from the Nidoran line. But it goes even further, because something doesn't add up. If all Kangaskhan are female, how does the species continue to exist? Breeding mechanics would later answer that question, because contrary to what early players might have assumed, Pokemon don't just breed with their own species. They can breed with others within the same egg group, and in those cases, the offspring always belongs to the mother's species, which explains Kangaskhan almost too perfectly. They would reproduce with other Pokemon from the monster egg group, but since the mother is always Kangaskhan, the offspring will always be Kangaskhan too. It fits so well that it almost makes you wonder if that mechanic was introduced just to make Kangaskhan make sense. This is something Pokemon does constantly, using the anime and movies to introduce early ideas that later get revisited as official mechanics in the games. The Crystal Onyx was originally explained as a Pokemon whose body adapted to the cave's conditions, something similar to the carbonization process that leads to Steelix, but taken in a different direction. However, with the introduction of terastallization, you could argue that this natural phenomenon was later reinterpreted and systematized through Terra Energy technology, the Crystal Onyx even resisted and was weak to different types than a normal Onyx, so it's not that far-fetched to imagine it as an early version of a Terra state, with its trainer disappearing, leaving it trapped in that altered form. The exotic variations seen in the Orange Islands, and later the Alolan forms, sightings of giant Pokémon, and then Dynamax, even Misty recalling what looked like a Mega Gyarados. The list goes on and on. Now let me talk about something that is not a prediction of the future, something many people bring up when discussing this topic. The girl in Rock Tunnel who talks about dreaming of a Pokémon covered in pink flowers, supposedly predicting Munna, a Pokémon tied to dreams with that exact appearance. But I've always thought this is a misinterpretation of the dialogue. During the development of the first generation, Pokémon were originally conceived as much more hostile, aggressive creatures, beings that weren't easy to tame. That vision changed over time, turning them into friendlier companions and introducing a wider variety of softer, more approachable designs for broader audiences. But traces of that original concept still remain in Generation 1. The eerie and bizarre sprites, trainers using whips, and possibly this girl, because her dialogue may not be referencing a specific Pokémon at all, but rather expressing a wish that Pokémon weren't so scary and that there could be one like that. Let's be honest. Sooner or later, a pink flower-themed Pokémon was bound to exist. And even if we entertain the unlikely idea that she was referring to Munna, it would be less of a prediction and more of a recycled concept. But there is a Pokémon tied to dreams that may have anticipated something much more recent. Darkrai. In its movie, Darkrai creates a parallel gray-toned city, and there's even official artwork showing Darkrai guiding Pokémon into that parallel dimension. But this time, it seems to be saving them, bringing them into a safe reality in the middle of some kind of catastrophe. This aligns with the more heroic interpretation of Darkrai that has gradually been reinforced over the years. A Pokémon that is often seen as malevolent, spreading chaos, when in reality, it was always trying to protect others. If you want to dive deeper into that story and the supposed evil of other legendary Pokémon, click the video on screen where I rank every legendary and mythical Pokémon from good to evil.